Hamas are watching for people to enter the buildings, and when they enter, they physically detonate the bomb.
What were your experiences in Gaza? What did you see? I mean, did you have critiques of what they were doing?
There's no point sugarcoating it. The wreckage of Rafah was shocking. You know, is it because the IDF has been bombing indiscriminately and just smashing the place up for fun? Or is there a better reason? I think questions do need to be asked about why that wasn't done from the offset. They must have known.
They claim 55,000 killed. Israel claims 20 to 25,000 of them are militant. What do you believe about these numbers?
And we found that 98% of the world's media were using Hamas's number. 3% of the world's media we studied were using the IDF's number of how many combatants they thought they'd kill. I'm quite tired of being gaslit. I know what I've seen, and I know what the evidence I've seen is, and it's beyond question.
Should Israel let journalists into Gaza?
And there's a really simple answer, and it's
Witkoff's deal, it allows Hamas to continue existing.
how do you destroy Hamas and return the hostages? And it means that one of them has to compromise. You know, Hezbollah is not just a Lebanese militia, it's a global narco ring that has huge South American drug smuggling and drug running routes, that runs guns, people and drugs into Europe.
Really?
Absolutely, they're a global crime syndicate. I have seen footage far and above the video they show people. I've seen evidence way beyond that, and it's so horrific I can barely talk about it without the hair on my arm standing up.
Before you hear from Andrew Fox, I ask if you want to support this show. All you have to do is press subscribe. If you do that, I can have more phenomenal guests like Andrew Fox exploring the issues you want to hear about that the mainstream media won't touch. And if you head over to winstonmarshall.co.uk, you'll have an extended conversation between me and Andrew where he takes some of your questions from winstonmarshall.co.uk. But without further ado, Andrew Fox. Well, Andrew, thank you so much for coming to speak with me. The reason I wanted to talk to you is because as a former British Army officer and a specialist in the Middle East, I wanted to look at what we might expect next in that region. You've put out a series of Substack pieces where you set out what you think might be on the horizon. As we speak now, Israel are overnight been bombing the Houthis and across Yemen. There's, I believe, Netanyahu's on a flight with Special Envoy Witkoff to DC. We're waiting to hear back whether Hamas will accept the 60-day ceasefire. What that means, you've got your ideas about whether or not that's a good idea, which I'm keen to tuck into that. Before we do, though, maybe you'd give me and viewers a bit of your background.
Yeah, so I served in the British Army for 16 years. I did a law degree at university, and then decided that jumping out of planes would be way more fun than being a solicitor. So I joined the Army, did 3 years with the Royal Welsh Fusiliers, and then transferred to the Parachute Regiment. Did 3 tours in Afghanistan, all in combat roles, one of which was US Army Special Forces, doing various raids and helicopter interdictions and some pretty, boys' own stuff, which was a bit of a career highlight. Further tours in Bosnia and Northern Ireland, Middle East.
Wow, you served everywhere.
Yeah, and I did 2 company commands in the Parachute Regiment. I was really lucky. So I did one at Special Forces Support Group and then one at 3 Para, which is...
What's 3 Para?
3 Para is 3rd Battalion, the Parachute Regiment, which is one of the 2 battalions that takes the lead on the Army's highest readiness forces. So when someone goes out the door first, it's always 2 or 3 Para or 16 Air Assault Brigade, which is their parent kind of formation. But I left the Army in 2021. I was lucky enough that I had the Army pay for numerous master's degrees and things like that. So I went to teach straight away at the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst, where I was training officer cadets in the academic side of war studies and the academic side of behavioural science, focusing on leadership. And from there, I was offered a job at the Henry Jackson Society, which is a think tank in Westminster, where I focus on defence and the Middle East.
When you said you served in the Middle East, where were you serving?
That's
I
can't talk about that.
I can't talk about that. Okay, but you have been to Gaza since October 7th, 2023.
Yeah, I have. It was a really interesting pathway there. So I had a lot of Jewish friends who I'd been working with to help get Afghans out of Afghanistan after the fall of Kabul.
In 22?
21, 22.
21,
yeah.
Sorry, yeah.
It was into 22 with the evacuation.
Right.
And the Jewish community in Manchester gave us the charity wraparound that we needed to help kind of get this over the line. So 7th of October happened, huge surge in anti-Semitism. I wanted to stand up for my Jewish friends, and that translated into an invitation to Israel in May last year, 2024.
By those friends or?
They, by their connections in Israel, so it was BICOM, British Israel Council, something like that.
Okay.
They exist to promote good relations between Israel and the UK.
Okay.
And that spun into various other visits because I wrote about it when I came back, got traction. And then I effectively breached the IDF's wall of trust. Once you're inside the wall of trust with the IDF, they're very wilco. And essentially all they ask is that you report fairly. They don't expect you to give them puff pieces. They don't expect you to be a propagandist. They just ask that if you criticise, you do it in a fair way, rather than some of the outlandish criticisms we've seen them getting.
Mm-hmm.
And that led to me being invited into Gaza on a couple of occasions, down in Rafah, down on the southern border with Egypt, and the Netzarim corridor, which is kind of like the waistband of Gaza. Which stretches all the way from the Israeli border through to the Mediterranean, and it's one of the movement control corridors separating North Gaza from the rest of the Strip. And I also went into Lebanon with the IDF and saw the captured Hezbollah tunnels up in Lebanon. So I got a good wander around underground there. So
you said twice into Gaza.
Yeah. That's
right. When exactly?
So that would have been July and November last year.
Okay. So and then when did you go to southern Lebanon?
That was also November.
Also November. Okay. So maybe we should just go into that actually a little bit. What were your experiences in Gaza? What did you see? I mean, you say the IDF wants you to just report fairly, but did you have critiques of what they were doing?
Yeah, I did. I wrote about it in The Spectator. I've written about it on my Substack. And the first thing I think that needs addressing is just how destroyed the place is. There's no point sugarcoating it. The wreckage of Rafah was shocking, even for someone who's been in war zones, who's called for airstrikes, and who was expecting it to be bad. Even then, it still, physically took me back to see how wrecked the place was. But the fairness comes in when you look at why, and I think that's the really important thing here. Is it because the IDF has been bombing indiscriminately and just smashing the place up for fun? Or is there a better reason? And there is a better reason, and it's because Hamas have booby-trapped and dug tunnels underneath and weaponized huge tracts of Gaza. And if you look at the maps that you can see, Honest Reporting have done an interactive map of the tunnels identified. They're everywhere, longer than the London Underground in distance, longer than the Paris Metro or the New York subway, 500 kilometers of tunnels under this place. And on top of that, you have 57,000 shafts coming up from those tunnels that lead to people's houses, children's bedrooms, mosques, hospitals, you name it.
Yeah.
And when Hamas are putting IEDs, improvised explosive devices, in these tunnels, as a military kind of going through and trying to clear that, you've got two options. You either commit your engineers to clearing, thousands of IEDs one at a time, or you just level it. And if you're trying to maintain any sort of momentum in a military operation, you cannot be stopping every house to wait for the engineers to come in and defuse.
What in real times? What is the sort of time difference between those two different approaches?
So in Afghanistan, if we found an IED and we called out improvised explosive device disposal teams, we're talking hours and hours just for one device. So in Afghanistan, we would go firm. We would call forward the EOD. We would wait for them to arrive. That could take any time, depending on how busy they were elsewhere.
Mm-hmm.
They then take the time they needed to defuse it, which also takes a lot of time because it's a very slow, meticulous process for obvious reasons. And then, of course, once they've cleared the first device, you have to make sure there's no secondary devices anywhere else.
Mm-hmm.
And in Gaza, actually, one of the things they're seeing is that these devices are actually remote operated. So they're not victim operated, like in Afghanistan, where you tread on a pressure plate and the device activates. They're on a wire in Gaza, and they've actually got cameras with wires going down into the tunnels. And Hamas are watching for people to enter the buildings. And when they enter, they physically detonate the bomb. So that makes EOD impossible because it's under Hamas's control for the entirety of its existence. So the IDF really don't have any other tactical options but to level the building either through an airstrike or through a controlled detonation using a dozer. They've been using bulldozers heavily in Gaza in a way that I don't think has ever been done before in urban warfare. So there's lessons to learn about how the IDF have done this.
Doesn't really sound like a critique. I mean, you are kind of somewhat preaching to the converted. Like I agree that with what you're saying, or I agree that that's an appropriate way of dealing with that issue for the IDF. But that's not a critique of the IDF. That's actually a defense of the IDF. On the topic of conflicts in the Middle East, let's take a quick look at how the media is reporting on Trump's new Israel-Gaza ceasefire deal using ground news. Now, left-leaning Middle East Eye ran the headline, "Trump beware, enabling Israel to impose its will on the Middle East will backfire." We specifically partnered with Ground News because their app and website help me and my team cut through media bias and get the full picture on any story like this one. There are over 675 articles published on Trump's new Israel-Gaza ceasefire deal, and we can access every single one through Ground News, complete with source context and key breakdowns. Meanwhile, right-leaning The Express led with, "Trump announces Israel-Gaza ceasefire deal, but warns it will only get worse." Two very different narratives from left and the right. Seeing all sides, regardless of political lean, is essential to making informed decisions and spotting bias. That's why Ground News' blind spot feed, which highlights stories underreported by either side, is such a powerful tool. I genuinely believe in what Ground News is doing, and I ask you to check it out by scanning the QR code or visiting ground.news/Winston. If you subscribe through my link, you'll get 40% off unlimited access. Ground News is subscriber funded. So, by supporting my sponsors, you are also supporting this show.
I don't think it is. I think because I'm looking at both what the options are on the table and making an assessment as to whether they're reasonable and appropriate or not. And I think
You're saying they're not appropriate?
No, I think they are.
So there's a defence then of what they're doing?
Well, no, because if I come to the opposite conclusion, I'd say that also. So I'm weighing up all the alternatives here. So, alternative one is you deploy EOD. Is that feasible? Probably not. Option two is doing what they're doing. Is that feasible? Yes. And there aren't really any other options here. That's the issue. We can certainly critique things like IDF discipline. Let's talk about that. On my visit to the Netzarim corridor, I went to one of the camps with 252 Division, which is a reserve division. And with a professional eye, I thought it was a shambles, quite frankly. The camp laydown was scattered. The troops they weren't as switched on as you would expect. To find someone to talk to us, they were essentially going round the blokes and asking who speaks English. There was no real organisation. Their command structure is incredibly flat. So generals will get phone calls from staff sergeants that they know in real life, and they'll be arcing the entire chain of command out of the picture. And we can see how that plays out in real time when we look at the start of the war, and there were all those sort of selfies of IDF soldiers making idiots of themselves in Gaza. And that is a reflection of their command culture and the discipline, or the lack thereof, that we see in the IDF. So if you want actual criticism, that's a criticism. A critique, I think, is looking at all the options on the table and deciding whether or not they're appropriate and correct or not.
Okay, I see. Well, let's just stick on Gaza then for a moment. This is since your visit, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation has been set up, American-backed group, and there's been some, scandal would be to say the least, but it's very confusing to work out exactly what's going on because different things are being reported, and not least by the BBC or re-reported by the BBC and Haaretz and Al Jazeera. And so this foundation was set up to bring aid to Gaza. There was some reports that the IDF had been shooting indiscriminately at them. Then the GHF, I think this was about 2 months, this was maybe even a month ago, reported actually, in fact, it's Hamas who are shooting at us. Then another story came out from the Times of Israel, which I consider a lot more reliable than Haaretz, who was saying actually it was in fact the IDF who had been shooting at Gazans. Initially, the story was that they were shooting directly, and they were ordered to shoot at them. And it was a mistranslation of the Hebrew, and they were ordered to shoot in the direction to discourage people coming to a certain area. But then, as I said, Times of Israel later said, no, in fact, dozens were killed by IDF. And even the IDF admitted, mistakes were made. So there's a sort of a conversation that I'd like to have with you about how the media is covering all of this. But what's your analysis of the aid distribution to Gaza? This seems to be the most controversial issue at the moment.
Yeah, let's take the tactical stuff aside and we'll come back to that. I think if we look at the strategy behind it, it makes a lot of sense, because if your objective as a military campaign is to essentially dismantle Hamas, to remove their administrative functions, remove their ability to attack Israel in future, remove their ability to control the Gaza Strip, you have to attack their levers of control. And the biggest lever of control they've had this war is aid, where significant percentages of it have been diverted to Hamas, where they've used it to pay, sell it and pay their soldiers, where they've used it as a mechanism to control the people of Gaza. So at a strategic level, it makes perfect sense to try and separate the people of Gaza from Hamas. And that actually goes back to the same counterinsurgency strategy that we in the West use. I mean, it's not been hugely successful in recent years, but the underpinning ethos behind it is that you separate the insurgent from the people.
How on earth do you do that in
Gaza? And exactly, and that's been part of the trouble the IDF have had, I think, for the last, 21 months, is that there's nowhere for the people to go. And even if they move to the humanitarian zones, Hamas can move with them. And that's why we've seen strikes in humanitarian zones in Gaza, because Hamas go there too. Of course they do. When your entire strategy is to hide behind people, you go where the people are. If we look at the tactical or strategic other side, it makes perfect sense for Hamas to have done that. But I think if you can cut the aid, you're cutting Hamas's finances, you're cutting people's reliance on them for food and for food distribution. Now, I'm not saying Hamas distributed every gram of food that's gone into Gaza during the war. I mean, I think the most recent, most credible estimate I've seen is about 25% of aid was being diverted by Hamas.
Oh, so only 75% was getting to the people?
Yeah, exactly that.
Mm-hmm.
And even then, obviously, distribution problems in a war zone, that's why if there is hunger in Gaza, that's where it comes from. It's from the challenges of that distribution. Because, we know that double the aid has gone in to Gaza than went in before the war. In terms of the amount of food that's gone in. So there was no starvation before the war, and now there's twice as much going in, and yet there's starvation. So it's clearly on the distribution side that the issue is. And so it makes strategically perfectly good sense for the GHF to go in and try what they're trying. And it seems to be broadly successful. If we take away the noise around people getting shot, and we can talk about that, tens of millions of meals are getting distributed. So it seems to be a plan that works. And when you couple that with other efforts, for example, empowering rival clans in Gaza to seize areas, seize the control of those areas away from Hamas, that sort of dual strategy, I think, does separate the people from Hamas. And it's whether, I think, under the imminently proposed ceasefire, Israel has the chance to finish that job, is what will decide whether or not Hamas remains in control.
We'll come to the
Gaza
ceasefire,
afterwards.
but just on then, given your military background, when you hear that the IDF, even they themselves admit that they kill people at this aid distribution, and that mistakes were made, I think, or something like that. From a military point of view, given your experience, how do you interpret that sort of information?
Again, it sounds to me, reading between the lines, and obviously I don't know categorically because I've not been there, I've not seen it, I've not seen the incident reports, so I'm not going to specify, what definitely happened. But what it sounds like to me is that they have tried to use weapons fire as a means of controlling the population. And by controlling, what I mean is, first of all, protecting themselves, the IDF, from people who would be approaching their positions. Because for context, the way it works is there's a GHF site that has contractors, armed contractors, doing the intimate local security for that, with IDF essentially oversight, a bit removed. So if you have people approaching the IDF positions, it is reasonable that you would fire warning shots to keep people back. There's normally an escalatory pathway. I haven't seen the exact IDF one in the vicinity of the GHF sites. But I have seen their procedures in Netzarim, which is originally a warning verbally, then a low warning shot, and then a kind of injury warning shot. So there is an escalatory pathway here. So that's one option that could be. Trying to keep people away from certain areas, that could be an option. Frankly, these aren't great tactics. It's not what you choose as your first option. If you had to, if you had the full menu of military tactics to choose from, that's not the one you choose. But again, if we go back to what I was saying in Rafah about the IEDs, look at the options on the table here to try and do crowd control. They can't kit up into riot gear and push forward because they'd be exposed to attacks from Hamas, IEDs, small arms fire. And just the other day, we saw hand grenades thrown into one of the GHF sites, which I think it wounded or killed 2 of the contractors that were in there.
Wow.
So that was just in the last couple of days. So the threat is real, and it's far too high a threat, I think, to push out full public order formations. I think the IDF accept that they didn't get their signage right, they didn't get their kind of crowd control barriers and stuff right, and they've adapted and they've changed that. Frankly, that's a very basic error to have made. I think questions do need to be asked about why that wasn't done from the offset. They must have known large crowds would come to these sites. So why were they not having at least barriers in place to sort of channel people towards the right place and make sure there's not crushing and that sort of thing? But this is a kinetic war zone. And on top of that, Hamas have every incentive to try and get the IDF to open fire. And I think that is a factor that people seem to totally ignore in this war, is that you can't look at a war and just judge one side's actions in isolation. You have to look at both sides, because war is reaction and counter-reaction. And if you're not looking at both sides here, then you're not doing an honest job of analysis. And Hamas know this will harm them. You can see by the way the disinformation storm around the GHF has rampaged up to unprecedented levels, as it always does when Hamas is under pressure. So the fact we're seeing that shows it's working in many ways. And the one thing they want to do is stop people going to those sites and keep them coming to the Hamas warehouses and the Hamas distribution sites.
Because it's their way of controlling Gazans
exactly
themselves.
that.
Okay.
And so Hamas has every incentive to draw fire. And I suspect when they do an investigation into this, they will find Hamas presence and Hamas kind of instigation of some of these incidents. And then I think the final point to note is the allegations of wildly, indiscriminately firing into crowds doesn't quite add up, because the weapon systems they're alleging the IDF are using are the big guns. We're talking mortars, we're talking tank rounds, we're talking snipers. If they were using those weapon systems, you would see hundreds of casualties a day. Even the Haaretz article said it was 1 to 5 fatalities a day. Okay, with one mortar round, you would get 1 to 5 fatalities, just one round. And if they're launching indiscriminately mortars and tank rounds and bullets in, you would see hundreds and hundreds of deaths. So that allegation doesn't make any sense to me, unless the IDF are the worst shots in the planet, which I don't think they are, having seen them in action. So there is a very skewed version of this, which is clearly incorrect. Are the IDF completely free of any blame or mistakes here? No, I don't think that's true either. So as ever, the truth will be somewhere in the middle, and you have to look at both sides before you make a final analysis.
Let's come to the ceasefire then. Witkoff's deal. The most striking thing about this to me is that it allows Hamas to continue existing. Now, can Israel say that the war objectives or the war has been in any way won, and there's that peace can be secured for the future if Hamas still exists?
Yeah, it's a tricky one. And I think there is a core contradiction that's been the bane of Israel's strategic objectives from the start, from 7th of October onwards. And that is, how do you destroy Hamas and return the hostages? How are those two things going to be reconciled? And it means that one of them has to compromise. And it's as simple as that. Military action is not going to recover the hostages. The IDF already holds 65%-ish of Gaza. They've killed almost every Hamas commander. They've killed 20,000 plus Hamas combatants. And yet there are still a significant number of hostages, and the vast majority that have been freed freed through deals. We can think back to Operation Arnon, where the special forces went in and rescued 4 hostages. That was minutes or seconds away from being a total disaster. And it was only danger close airstrikes that allowed those troops and the hostages to get away safely. That was kind of April last year, I think, off the top of my head. It might have been June, but yeah, it was sort of early, first half of last year. And I think that deterred the IDF from trying those again. We also know that hostages have been executed when the IDF have gotten too close. We saw that with Hirsch, Goldberg, Polin, and the other 5 that were killed alongside him. There's every bit of evidence to suggest that they were killed because the IDF were closing in. So military hostage recovery isn't going to happen. Military pressure might drive Hamas to the negotiating table, and I think that's what we're seeing here. But that still needs negotiations, which means somebody's going to have to make a compromise on both sides. So what we have to then look at, I think, when we're gauging success or failure, is looking at the extent to which strategic goals have been achieved. Like Hamas are now no longer a threat in the sense of 7th of October. They don't have the capability or the ability to repeat that. So for now, Israel's border is secured.
I mean, they're still sending missiles, and not on the level of October 7th, but they are a huge threat to the future, and they're a threat, most of all, to the Gazans themselves.
Yeah, I think we'll get to that. If we look at the missiles, we're talking 1 or 2 popped off Iron Dome, or
Right, right.
it's more than capable to deal with them. So, in terms of being an actual credible threat, not really.
Okay.
Governance still in existence. Quite clearly, they still govern huge tracts of the Gaza Strip. So that's not been achieved. And the killer piece of this ceasefire deal is, are they then going to have the ability to recover and regain where they were? And that's the really killer question that I think hinges the successful failure of the mission, quite frankly. Because if there is a deal that, a 60-day ceasefire turns into a permanent ceasefire, turns into reconstruction without the correct oversight to make sure Hamas can't seize that reconstruction stuff and start rebuilding tunnels and terror bases, etc., etc. And if Israel doesn't have the right to strike back in when they see that happening, then that is a real problem. And I would agree that you could probably say the war hasn't been a success if Hamas are in a position to rebuild.
Do you think any of the Arab nations would accept Hamas continuing? So, obviously, you look at a nation like Qatar, they very much facilitating Hamas operations. So maybe that's an exception, and the Iran axis of evil, or another exception. But if you look at what I see as the positive future for the Arabs, which is basically the monarch Sunni nations, notably the Emiratis and the Jordanians. And actually, I'm being pretty hopeful about Syria as well, although there's an interesting question to have there about Jelani and his past. But can they themselves, they know, as Hamas, as a Muslim Brotherhood organization, they're not an organization that those guys want to work with. And there's rumors that the Emiratis might be part of some sort of Gaza management deal. Like they couldn't possibly accept Hamas still existing, right?
It's a tricky one because the Gulf states are having to balance what they know it makes strategic sense versus the kind of feeling on the ground in the Arab world. There is a huge anti-Israel sway.
It's much worse now.
Vastly
I was
worse,
just in Oman, and I've been to Oman a couple of times, but this time I was actually nervous to even really speak about against anything. The anti-Israel sentiment is higher than I've ever seen before.
Yeah, and I've done interviews on Egyptian TV where they just talk about the Gaza genocide as if it's a given fact. And that's the messaging they're getting. Stand fast, Al Jazeera, even your basic sort of news channels are giving horror stories about Israel slaughtering innocent Palestinians, at scale. And, that does create a tension for the leadership of those countries because they know what's already happening. And they know that the future for peace in the Middle East is peace with Israel and economic development and everyone getting much richer as a result. But getting to that point is really tricky because the last thing they want to do is normalize with Israel and suddenly find a second Arab Spring with, an uprising in their own countries.
Right, yeah.
So they've got that balance to strike, which makes things really tricky. And I think when you talk about accepting Hamas remaining, it depends what that Hamas looks like and what terms are placed upon them by the deal that Witkoff gets them to sign. And, the Witkoff deal, I think one of the huge flaws is it kicks all these problems down the line. 60-day ceasefire now, hostage exchange with prisoners from the Israeli side. And then we'll talk about the other stuff later. And of course, in that 60 days, Hamas is going to have the chance to reconstitute, have the chance to reclaim control of aid, reclaim areas of control over the population of Gaza. And then in 60 days' time, they'll be in a much stronger position, even if hostilities resume. So that's a really key flaw in that Witkoff deal. But the flip side to that is, how do you get the deal over the line in the first place? How do you get Hamas to sign it if part of it includes them being put into exile or handing over power? They're never going to agree, are they? So, they're in a huge bind here when it comes to a deal, which suggests to me that actually letting Israel push on might be the better option. It's not the better option for people in Gaza and the innocent civilians who are living in a deeply unpleasant situation. But if we're talking grand strategy at the highest level, Hamas is a huge roadblock to peace in the Middle East.
But as you point out earlier in this conversation, that would sort of possibly mean giving up on the hostages, right? So that's the trade-off for the Israelis.
Yeah, it's really tricky. Do you prioritise the lives of, I think it's 20 to 22 they think are alive out of the 50 that are still in there? Do you prioritise them, or do you prioritise the future peace for however many million Israelis and Arabs that live in the region? And that's a hell of a decision to have to make. And, undeniably, it would cause psychological wounds to the state of Israel and the people in Israel if they knew they'd abandoned the hostages. It kind of goes against core tenets of Judaism. It goes against everything they believe in as a country that sees itself as, a bastion amongst states who wish for their destruction. And it's almost like a team effort, and leaving members of the team behind just goes against everything that ethos purports to stand for. So, again, incredibly tricky strategic bind.
So maybe we can sort of zoom out and look at post 12-day war, where we are now in the Middle East. I've told you before we started taping that I was in Israel for the whole duration of that conflict, and people who have been watching this show will know what I think about it, which is that it was the head of the snake, it was the head of the octopus, and it has set back, in my opinion, Iran, or this is according to the Pentagon actually, so it's not my opinion, it set back Iran's nuclear ambitions a couple of years, and they were funding Hezbollah, Assad, although Assad obviously gone for different reasons, well, not entirely different reasons, and Hamas, and then the Houthis, as we said, there's still conflict with the Houthis in Yemen. What post the 12-day war, what's your verdict? What's your analysis of where this leaves the region? Was it successful? Has it pushed things forward in a positive way? Has it set things back? I don't actually know where you stand on it. Perhaps you're kind of one of these people who see it as a repeat of the Iraq War. The American right are very upset about that. What's your analysis of it?
So it's a moment of opportunity. I'm very wary of the sort of hubris that we saw after the Iran strikes, where people seem to think that that was the nuclear program done forever, the whole region now much safer. I don't think that's the case. As you say, only 1 to 2 years delay on that nuclear program. Trump's only going to be around for another 3 years. Everything Iran could do right now is just to wait out Trump and hope for a less assertive president in the White House. And that would be a perfectly logical thing for Iran to do. Is just wait it out, quietly rebuild where they can in secret, and then resume their long-term strategy.
Hope for another Obama or a Biden.
Exactly that.
Which is even worse than just unassertive American. It's an American who's actually completely trying to go along and sort of
who's so
pay
passive,
them off.
They've effectively encouraged the malign actions of Iran. Yeah, absolutely. If we look at Hezbollah, I think it was telling that they didn't have any way of counter-punching when Israel was bombing Iran. That was almost their entire reason for existence, was to be that tripwire. So if Iran came under attack, they would be able to overwhelm Israel's missile defenses with 150,000 missiles that they fired, in great barrages to wipe out the missile defenses. And obviously that didn't happen. And most estimates said that Hezbollah had maybe 1 to 4 days combat in them. That's how degraded they are.
Wow.
Yeah, incredible.
That's all they've got left.
Yeah.
Wow.
And of course, with the route through Syria now cut off, resupply is incredibly difficult.
That was so important, by the way. This is another aspect of this war, that kind of ultimate, incredible game of risk played by Israel. And by that, I mean the board game risk. Because Assad not being gone, which is, he was obviously propped up by both the Russians and Iranians. Russians... my analysis is that they're so exhausted by the Ukraine wars that they couldn't afford to, even if they wanted to, although perhaps there's other aspects to it there. And then Iran not supporting them, the Hezbollah, who were Assad's militia, not being able to, after the ceasefire, and was it in December, not being able to support Assad anymore. So, I might have got these dates wrong, because Assad fell in December, didn't he?
Off the top of my head,
something like that. But anyway, so not having that land bridge, just the timing of everything that Israel to set things up for the Israel-Iran war has been incredibly impressive.
Yeah, there've been elements of luck and elements of planning, and as you say, the stars just aligned. And without Hezbollah opening fire on 8th of October, they don't get degraded to the point where Syria suddenly falls. And then Israel doesn't have the free airspace to go and attack Iran. So all of these things have just lined up beautifully, both through chance and through planning. Interestingly, when I spoke to Yoav Gallant in Tel Aviv, he was very keen on hitting Hezbollah first and just leaving Gaza until Hezbollah were dealt with, because they were the much bigger threat. Whereas Bibi obviously wanted to go Gaza first and keep going through Gaza.
That's an interesting tactic to have taken, given the hostages were in Gaza.
It is, but he cited
To just let the hostages be.
he cited Clausewitz and was essentially saying hit the enemy's center of gravity, which is where
What's that? So
the center of gravity is the thing that it's the linchpin of their whole strategy. That's what you try and put your strength against, the center of gravity. And he assessed that was Hezbollah because of the huge threat from those rockets.
Okay.
So that was he was thinking in very cold, clinical military terms. But yeah, if we, I think one of the frustrations of this entire 21-month war has been people obsessively focusing on Gaza and completely ignoring the fact that this was a 7-front war from a variety of different countries. And if you just focus on Gaza, you just lose sight of the bigger picture. And I think far too many people in certainly the West have done that to the exclusion of useful analysis, quite frankly.
Right, let's go through the 7 fronts. Hezbollah, Assad, or Syria, Iran, Houthis, Hamas,
Iraq, the militias in Iraq as well.
With the Iranian militias in Iraq.
Yeah, it's a quarter of a million under arms in Iraq.
And then the 7th, would that be in the West?
Yeah, so you've got the front that is the lawfare front.
The lawfare front, okay.
Yeah.
So this is the ICC.
The ICJ, the media, et cetera, et cetera. So it's been a huge, complicated, well-coordinated beast with Iran as the head of the snake. But anyway, I think we're talking about where we're going forward here. And so I think Hezbollah degraded, very difficult to rearm because Syria's closed. They will focus on consolidating their political power in Lebanon. And that will include things like bringing reconstruction to those Shia areas in the south. And showing that Hezbollah is still a useful force for them to maintain their popular support and then hope to rebuild over years and months in the future. If we look at Iran, they're just going to keep stum until Trump's out of the White House and then wait and see.
Mm-hmm.
They may have secret facilities left, but I don't think they're going to take the chance of losing them as well. So it makes perfect sense for them to sit still and do not much and perhaps leverage their overseas proxies. Hezbollah is not just a Lebanese militia; it's a global narco ring that has huge South American drug smuggling and drug running routes, that runs guns, people, and drugs into Europe. They have the ability to. Oh, absolutely, they're a global crime syndicate as well as a Lebanese militia.
Have they got any influence in Britain?
Well, they've certainly got these penetrating routes into Europe, so they will almost certainly have chains that go forward.
Do you know anything more about those routes into Europe?
Not in huge detail. No, that's not really my lane. It's just something I'm aware of that happens. But certainly, guns, drugs, people, money. The crypto smuggling they do is there's huge amounts of stuff that Europol have pushed out about Hezbollah. If people want to learn more, go to the Europol website and search for Hezbollah.
Okay.
So they're on a slow beat rebuild. We can look at Hamas and say, look, they're not destroyed yet, and a lot is going to depend on what the ceasefire deal looks like. The Houthis are still a nuisance, but not an existential one. Very few things they've fired have actually got through. There was a drone, wasn't there, in Tel Aviv, but in terms of the ballistic stuff, that's not reaching. And then if you look at the West Bank, of course, that's been hugely ignored, or Judea and Samaria, depending on how militant your listeners are about nomenclature. The IDF have done an incredible job of suppressing potential uprisings in the West Bank. Constant raids into the various hotspots, destroying militia bases, destroying attempts to sort of surge arms across the Jordanian border into the West Bank. They've had whole brigades in there, guarding that border to try and intercept arms shipments, and that is a touch point. The Palestinian Authority they're aging. They are undermined by how much support Hamas have generated in the West Bank through this war. 70% approval rating in the West Bank
of Hamas.
Yeah, so they've had a really, really good war.
What's the approval rating of Fatah?
It's lower than that. It's much lower than that. They're pretty unpopular right now, Fatah. And again, it's because they're seen as weak. They're seen as maybe having betrayed the Palestinian cause in some ways. And that is a real problem because there's an insurgency waiting to happen there. So that was the 7th Military Front in the West Bank.
Right, okay.
So the future there, I think, needs some very careful management. But we're already seeing the Emirate of Hebron being suggested in the media.
I saw that in the Wall Street Journal.
Yeah.
So he wants to recognise the Jewish state.
Yeah.
And
join the Abraham Accords.
And
essentially be a statelet within the area. to make peace with Israel and again get that financial economic relationship going, generate prosperity and wealth. And it makes a lot of sense. And I think that is a model that perhaps could be exported to the rest of the West Bank.
Yeah.
Because that feels like a route to Palestinian statehood to me in due course. Okay, it doesn't look like a unified state, but it could look like the UAE, where you've got a number of different emirates that come together and cooperate financially, economically, diplomatically. And that seems like, if it's based on normalization with Israel and recognition of Israel and, peace in exchange for prosperity, that feels like a much cleverer and more sophisticated route to a two-state solution than just trying to do this monolithically in the way that has failed continually since 1948.
Yeah. I want your take on the Houthis, because this is they're a group that have proved very tricky. Even Trump ended his attempts earlier in the year to his conflict with them. And as I said already, Israel have a bombing in Yemen as we speak, although by the time people are listening to this, we might know the outcome of that. But what's your analysis of what's going on in Yemen and how to deal with the Houthis?
Well, this has been going on for an awfully long time. In 2014, the Saudis, Bahrainis, UAE were sending troops into Yemen, and they were facing Russian Wagner militaries. They were facing the Houthis themselves, and then, of course, IRGC from Iran. They were all on the ground there, and they were lobbing missiles at each other, and it was kind of a horrible stalemate that degenerated into that appalling humanitarian situation. So it's nothing new that the Houthis are well armed and well backed by a variety of bad actors. The issue with Trump's raid, I believe, is that they could see them coming. It's a 45-minute flight time from the carriers to time on target. 45 minutes is a long time to get stuff moved or underground or wherever their defensive tactic is. So it's very, very difficult to kind of degrade them in that manner because, Gaza, it's a seconds flight time. You take off in Israel and you are straight over Gaza and you can drop. Right. With a long insertion for that, a long approach route for those planes, there's plenty of time for the Houthis to dodge and swerve, which makes them incredibly difficult. And then, of course, you've got the topography in Yemen, which lends itself towards hiding stuff. It's not a tiny coastal enclave like Gaza. It's, there's mountains, there's tunnels, there's all sorts of stuff where they can hide things. And there's not going to be any quick solution there. I think obviously cutting their supply lanes is the big one. And then degrading what they've got. So it's a very similar tactic to Hezbollah in many ways. You take out what you can find and you just make sure they can't replace it. Of course, when it's coastal routes of resupply, that's much harder to do. Ships can be quite, small boats can be quite hard to intercept. And if you're smuggling stuff on ships, then that's really tricky to intercept and interdict. So it's a much thornier problem. They are an Iranian-backed proxy. They are going to do as they're told. They are going to lob the odd missile at Israel. And I think the bigger question there is, can Israel absorb that? Is it a nuisance or is it an actual problem? And at the moment, I think it's just a nuisance. So it's not the end of the world, but it's still, a challenging obstacle in the pathway to peace, particularly if they go back to trying to interdict shipping that's traveling through the Red Sea or wherever. So
we've mentioned the Abraham Accords in passing a couple of times. I've a huge fan of the Abraham Accords and thought it was incredible what was mainly Jared Kushner who pulled it up in Trump's first term. And for me, that really is a signifier that there can be peace in the region between Israel and their neighbors. But I wondered what your analysis was on where this conflict has left the Abraham Accords. Can they be picked up again? You mentioned earlier that the heads of states might be want to, but the popular sentiment against Israel is so bad now. How can those heads of state, come at peace with Israel? Like, how do they repackage it for the people?
There is a key flaw in the original Abraham Accords, I think, and that's that it's sidelined any pathway to Palestinian statehood. So previously, normalization with Israel was contingent on a pathway to Palestinian statehood. The Abraham Accords sideline that. And actually, I genuinely think no Abraham Accords, no 7th of October. I think the reason Hamas launched when they did was a deliberate attempt to derail Saudi normalization talk.
Or Iran, right? Iran funded it. So what do you think it was Hamas?
Yes and no. I think Sinwar went fairly independently. I think it was very much a Palestinian-driven attack because they knew that if that normalization happened under the model of the Abraham Accords, they would be completely sidelined, which is a real problem.
Sidelined, but not completely. It's not like the kibosh isn't on it. It's just.
I mean, yes and no. I mean, if there's no clear pathway to Palestinian statehood from a Palestinian perspective, that is them completely sidelined, and they're then condemned to be in this cycle that they're in now forever. And they have no chance of ever achieving their main goal, which certainly for Hamas was the river to the sea, the complete eradication of Israel. So in the Abraham Accords, they saw a genuine threat to their kind of strategic goals. I think any progression of the Abraham Accords needs to consider that, and they need to think of a clever and creative way that they can find a solution to Palestine that does give them agency and eventual statehood, but you can incentivize them on that journey by saying, for example, in Gaza, reconstruction for peace, reconstruction for disarmament, and you can make things contingent on there being no violence. And in the West Bank, you can hopefully copy that Emirates model that we spoke about earlier. So there's options on the table here. Nothing's guaranteed. Obviously, it's the Middle East. There's never going to be a simple solution. There will be sticking points and diversions on the journey, but at least acknowledging that there's a problem and that you would like to find a solution is a good step. And that also, of course, would then help Arab populations get more on board with the idea of normalization. If you can show that actually the Palestinian dilemma is at least being addressed and there is a clear pathway to them reaching statehood, then that's probably how you sell it to those Arab populations. And I think the other challenge is going to be essentially a charm campaign, a charm offensive to try and win back, or at least bring back to the middle or to neutral gear the idea of working with the Israelis. And that's not a quick journey either.
It's hard to overturn what they've seen. As I mentioned, my experience in Amman, the anti-Israel sentiment is a fever pitch. And given your work in psychology, maybe you can help me using your expertise there. But how does one actually overturn this? A friend of mine I was speaking to last night says it can take 3 generations for those people to get over what they've seen on their mobile phones, regardless of whether it's propaganda or whether it's real. Even if it's propaganda, how do they get over what they've seen?
Well, as I said, going into Rafah and seeing the damage shocked me when I was expecting it and I've seen it before. And these are absolutely normal reactions, and I don't think that can be understated. But I suppose on top of that, with the Arab population, you have to layer generations of enmity towards the state of Israel even before this war started. They were effectively pushing an open door to demonize Israel to an even greater extent, weaponizing these images of destruction and damage. Completely absent from this conversation is the imagery from 7th of October, of course, which is by some measure far worse than anything that's happened in Gaza. I have seen footage far and above the video they show people. I've seen evidence way beyond that, and it's so horrific I can barely talk about it without the hair on my arm standing up. What Hamas did to Israelis.
Worse than I saw the 47-minute video. It's the most horrible thing I've seen in my life.
So if you see the sexual assault evidence on top of that, it's shocking. And it's not a level of detail I think your listeners particularly want to hear, but it is enough to make me lose my voice over it, as you can tell, probably. Horrendous. I can't even begin to describe how bad those pictures are. The Times of London just reported that indeed there's new evidence and testimonies describing the sexual assault carried out by Hamas on October 7th. This has been a weirdly a sticking point with the anti-Israel crew, even the ones who might have accepted the footage they have seen, will not accept that there was any sexual. And I'm sure people listening can know the sort of lefty firebrands that I'm talking about, who will say, no, there was no no rape on October 7th. But you're saying that absolutely there was the case. I'm quite tired of being gaslit. I know what I've seen, and I know what the evidence I've seen is, and it's beyond question. And there's a reason people deny it, and it's because the murders and the burning of kibbutzim, in their heads, they justify it as resistance. Hamas were justified in doing that because they lived in a concentration camp and yada, yada, yada. Obviously nonsense, but that's their position. When you throw rape into the mix, that's very hard to justify as the actions of a freedom-fighting resistance operation. And it kind of derails their entire narrative. So there's an immediate cognitive dissonance when people have the rape put to them. And I think that's why it's so denied. It's also damaging to the Arab audience, of course, where rape is not considered an acceptable behaviour. And again, that resistance narrative suddenly derails when you accept that Hamas went on a mass rape endeavour on 7th of October. So there's a very clear kind of psychology behind why people are so keen to deny this. And you can see when you mention it online, immediately the bot swarm descends upon you.
Yeah.
It's the one thing that triggers them off every single time. You can guarantee your mentions will be full of denial of this stuff. But, it wasn't just rape. It was mutilation and just absolutely unspeakable ways to treat a human body, quite frankly. And this new report's, it's, some of the evidence they talk about in this is stuff I've seen. And people go, why haven't they released it? Well, when in any rape in the West ever do we release the evidence? The victims have a right to privacy. They have a right to not have their worst moments released to the world for people to mock and say that it's faked and deny that what happened to them happened to them. Of course, it's this double standard that gets applied to Israel. Why haven't you showed your women being raped to the world? It's like, listen to yourselves when you ask this question. Absolutely horrifying.
Well, it's even worse in that the IDF are being accused of behaving like that in Gaza. Now, maybe it's my bias, but I find that very hard to believe. And I've not seen any footage of that. I've not seen any, and there's some footage you might find of sort of IDF sort of standing in a circle trying to hide something that's going on.
In prison, yeah.
What was that?
It was at the prison. It's the detention facility inside Israel itself. There's a video where essentially the guys put their shields up and you see a prisoner getting forced against the wall. But again, there's no evidence of rape there. The soldiers involved who were arrested weren't charged with rape. They are now suing people who published that they were rapists. So, they're confident enough in their own innocence that they are taking this to civil court for defamation. And again, there's no actual evidence of rape there. And the one other major report throughout the war about rape by the IDF was Al-Shifa Hospital. And Al Jazeera published that. And then the woman who made the allegation retracted 24 hours later. So Al Jazeera were forced to delete that article and retract it. There's lots of allegations. And quite frequently we see the old deny, reverse accusation piece here that you get in domestic abuses, where the abuser alleges they are the victim of what they've actually done. And you see this all the time, that inversion. There was a spate of videos that came out last year of like beheaded babies in Gaza. Bombs don't behead people and leave the rest of the body untouched. That's not how high explosive munitions work. It was clearly a Hamas attempt to mock Israel for the mistake they made on that reporting of 7th of October, talking about 40 beheaded babies, which was acknowledged as a mistake. It was acknowledged as misreporting. The IDF never claimed it, but Hamas saw an opportunity to mock Israel for that. And it's a pattern that you've seen time and time again throughout this conflict.
It's worth talking about the numbers we have, which everyone listening knows that we get this from the Gaza Health Ministry, which is run by Hamas. And I think as we speak now, it's something like they claim 55,000 killed. Israel claims something like 20 to 25,000 of them are militants. What do you believe about these numbers? What do you not believe? How do we interpret those? What's going on in the casualties and fatalities in Gaza?
Yeah, so I wrote a paper on this that was published last December. It was published through the Henry Jackson Society. It's called Questionable Counting, and it was what we call a qualitative study. You can't do quantitative analysis on this. You can't look at the numbers because you don't have access to the bodies. You don't have access to the military, the hospital records. You don't have access to the data you need to properly crunch it. So we're getting two kinds of reports: qualitative, which is what I've done, and then you have the statistical modelling where people kind of try and wave a wet finger in the air, looking at how they think it'll go, and they come up with a figure, be that higher or lower. It's almost always higher, which I think potentially suggests an agenda, but discuss. And what we found in our paper was a number of errors that suggested trends. So men misclassified as women, women misclassified as men, adults classified as children, people that we found on social media had been killed by Hamas were on those lists. And it doesn't matter if you think it's faked or not. You know, we're not saying definitively that Hamas are manipulating the numbers, but what we can say is that there were a significant number of errors in the total that the world's media had been reporting for more than a year. And then, of course, this most recent list, Hamas themselves removed 3,400 names because they didn't have enough evidence to have had them on there in the first place. So even Hamas agrees that there are challenges and difficulties when it comes to recording these casualty figures. But what we also looked at in our paper was the trends over the years. Obviously, there have been a lot of fisticuffs bouts in Gaza. You know, this is, I think, the 6th or 7th. Obviously the biggest, but there have been plenty of other operations beforehand. And there's a pattern, and it happens every time. Hamas release a figure. They never release militant or casualty deaths. They just give a total. The Israel Defense Forces will release what they think is the rough number of combatants that they've killed. And then about 3 or 4 months down the line, it all comes out that basically the total was about right and the IDF figure was about right as well. And this happens time and time again. Why is it so difficult for Israel to record how many combatants they've killed? It's probably a very good question. And the answer is the fog of war. Now, to give you an anecdote from personal experience, in Afghanistan, I was once in a firefight with the Taliban, and at the reorg, at the end of the firefight, when everything had finished and calmed down, my 3 section commanders who worked for me and we couldn't agree between the 4 of us what direction the enemy fire was coming in. Okay, when you're on your belt buckle and rounds are flying around the place, you're not counting bodies as they fall. Maybe the snipers are, you know, that's a very intimate way of killing someone through that level of magnified scope. Maybe they can keep a regular count, but your average squad on the ground, or your average rifleman has no ability to give you an accurate, especially when you're using indirect weapons that are firing over your heads, things like mortars or artillery, you know, big blast, lots of rubble, you know, it can't be done. But what you can do afterwards is have a debrief where you can roughly come up with how many you think were there and how many, you know, you might have definitely seen or might have seen. And that's why the IDF is operating at a ballpark figure rather than a specific figure, because of that chaos and the difficulty in working out exactly what happened during a firefight when everyone's adrenaline is flowing. People are terrified because it is scary, and anyone who says it's not is lying to you or a psychopath. You know, but this is you know, the highest end of human emotion, and you cannot expect soldiers to be meticulously counting everything as they go through this unbelievable experience that most people in the world never will, thankfully, have to experience. So that's why it's so difficult for the IDF. But they have been broadly accurate before. Maybe a bit of an overcount, but nothing that suggests, you know, they've got it wrong. And so when we look at, I think it's 56,000 now. If we look at the 56,000, we can say with relative certainty there will be some old age deaths in there. We look at the percentages of those killed in the 15 to 45 age group, which is roughly the fighting age of a man in Gaza, using, you know, with Hamas's well-documented use of child soldiers, that's 72% male in that age group, which certainly I think suggests that there is targeting going on here, especially if you think before the war, Gaza's population was only 25% male, adult male. It was 75% under 18s and women, 25% adult men. And yet 72% of the deaths are adult men. So there's definitely some targeting going on here. I think when the dust settles, the Hamas number will go up a bit and the IDF number will prove to be just about right.
Wow. What do you make of the media coverage then of everything? You've obviously been following it very closely, and like me, you'll have been seeing what the BBC have had to say, retracted. And I guess this brings us here to Britain a little bit. Maybe I should just ask you about the BBC. Are you satisfied with how they've covered the conflict?
Well, actually, we looked at this in the paper as well, and we found that when people were talking about the casualty figures, for example, 98% of the world's media were using Hamas's number. 3% of the world's media we studied were using the IDF's number of how many combatants they thought they'd killed. And it points to a wider trend, and the trend is this.
Shouldn't they do both?
Of course they
They
should.
should say, this is what Hamas say, this is what the IDF say.
Yeah, and even when they do mention it, it's normally buried at the bottom of the article, hidden away right at the end. But the trend we're seeing is this, where anything that comes out of Gaza from the sort of Palestinian side is taken as gospel. Anything that comes out from the Israeli side is taken with skepticism and suspicion. And that is the key media theme of this war. Israel unreliable, murderous psychopaths Hamas reliable. And I find that baffling. I genuinely don't understand it. I don't know if it's maybe just an institutional bias, if it's that framing where it's oppressor versus oppressed. I like to call it the Star Warsification of warfare, where the rebel is always the good guy. I don't know if it's that framing. I don't know if it's anti-Semitism and they just don't believe Jews. Some people maybe, but not everyone, certainly. Certainly some of the BBC Arabic journalists that they've used have certainly said some very ropey things about Jews on social media. So there's definitely some of that. But if I don't think that's what's motivating Jeremy Bowen or some of these other high-end journalists. So yeah, I don't understand it. But there is a trend here, and it is ignore Israel, trust everything that comes out of the Hamas side.
Should Israel let journalists into Gaza?
This is a really tricky one, and there's a really simple answer, and it's no. And the reason it's no is because they would die. I think it's that simple. There is a very well-known policy when it comes to journalists in war zones that they don't go into the very front lines. All of Gaza is a front line. You don't have journalists on the front line in Ukraine. It just doesn't happen. They don't go forward to where the artillery rounds are landing. They don't go forward to where the trenches are. And if they do, it's under the most incredibly stringent restrictions.
I actually do believe that Ukraine have a policy against, that official policy is that journalists aren't allowed there.
Yeah, I mean, you can get in, but it's not, like you say, it's not an official policy.
But sorry, just against that, wouldn't you just say you're allowed there, but there's a good chance you'll get?
Well, no, because the first time a journalist dies, that would immediately be blamed on Israel.
Yeah, so it's lose-lose.
Yeah, exactly.
It's doomed if you do, doomed if you don't.
Yeah, so it's much safer to deny the enemy that weapon of a dead journalist than it is to, allow them in there and let them take their own chances. So I can see why they do it. It's no different to any other war zone. And again, the criticism of this is that double standard against Israel. Every other war zone in the world is run this way. Why should it be wrong for Israel to run it this way as well?
But doesn't the saying that they will die if they go in there sort of imply just how bad it is for Gazans in there? Well,
no, because the areas the IDF are striking are mostly evacuated. That's the first thing. That's why the deaths are comparatively so low. As the kind of pro-Palestinian side is very keen to point out, there's more explosive been dropped on Gaza than was dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And yet there's barely a fraction of the death. It's because they're mostly evacuated areas. But obviously if journalists are pushing forward into evacuated areas, they're going to be very high risk. On top of that, Hamas would have every incentive to kill them themselves. And let's face it, from the people that did 7th of October, that's not outside the bounds of imagination that they might execute a journalist, claim it was the IDF that did it, and then weaponize that death against Israel. And on top of that, when I was in Lebanon, it was a pressed visit that I went into the tunnels with the IDF there, but there were only 5 people came forward, which I found really interesting. Like, this was a fascinating opportunity to go into a pristine, undamaged Hezbollah tunnel, see it firsthand and explore it. And they were very open with where they let us run around inside the tunnel because it was pretty safe. But there was nobody there. And I asked why. And the reason is because Hezbollah had said, if any news crews report on these tunnels, your news teams in Beirut will be under direct threat from us. So, there's all sorts of dynamics there where Hamas have the ability to threaten these journalists in other ways. To only report what Hamas want them to report. So again, it's just a lose-lose for Israel to allow these journalists in. I completely understand their decision, quite frankly.
Well, look, we've got some questions from some of our Substack viewers. So we're going to take this conversation over to the Substack subscriber section. Before we do that, though, is there any loose ends for this part of the conversation, do you think, that we need to tie together?
No, I think we've been pretty comprehensive. Actually, we've had a good run around the Middle East, haven't we?
We have. I mean, we this conversation could obviously go on for a long time. We could get into each country. It could be a whole series of podcasts. But great. Well, let's take those questions over at the Substack. Thank you so much. And before we do that, Andrew, before any people who aren't going to join us over there, where might they find you and your work?
So it's mrandrewfox.substack.com is where you get my main output, or I'm on Twitter as well, on X, and it's Mr_Andrew_Fox.
Great. Thank you, Andrew.
Thanks very much.
Thank you for watching the Winston Marshall Show with Andrew Fox. Head over to winstonmarshall.co.uk now for that extended conversation between me and Andrew, where he takes your questions from winstonmarshall.co.uk. And before I leave you, I ask if you want to support this show. All you have to do is press subscribe. If you do that, I can have more phenomenal guests like Andrew exploring the issues you want to hear about that the mainstream media will not touch. But until next time, be well.